And we welcome you into the Sporting News Studios with Matt Crossman and Stephen Levine. I'm Tom Vandervoort, talking NASCAR, talking the greatest drivers of all time. Crossman, you've got the list.
I do.
And who's number one?
We're going to start with number
Is it Petty? Is it Earnhardt?
It is not Petty, and it's not Dale Earnhardt Jr.
Wow. I meant senior.
It's not senior either.
No, it is the Silver Fox, David Pearson, as it should be, right?
Well, we polled 23 experts, drivers, crew chiefs, media members, that kind of thing, and Pearson won. I think it's.
Did he win by a lot? Can you tell us? Was it close?
He won by 2 car lengths.
Why do you think David Pearson came out on top after talking to all these folks?
I think it's pure driving ability. That's what the question was. And I think the consensus is that if you had to have one guy put in the car to go as fast as you possibly could, we're not talking about does he own the car, any of that kind of stuff. Just put him in the car, go fast. People would take Pearson.
Plus, to close the deal out, I mean, everybody calls Kevin Harvick the closer, but David Pearson was the original closer.
David Pearson was a closer when Kevin Harvick couldn't even dream of it.
David Pearson really rarely ran a full season, rarely ran for a championship. In 73, had 11 wins and 18 starts. I mean, something crazy like that. It's hard to dispute his talent level.
I think a lot of people, when they have this argument, they'll say, Petty had 7 championships, Earnhardt had 7 championships, and they drop the mic and walk away as if that ends the argument. Well, especially in Petty's era, the championships didn't really matter.
It didn't have the same significance as it does
Pearson
now.
ran 4 full seasons. 3rd, 1st, and 1st. So,
pretty good.
Yeah, and so to say, oh, he only had 3 championships, it's applying today's standards to the previous generation, which they didn't have that standard.
Well, let's look at the list as it is in the October 10th issue of Sporting News. So David Pearson first, Petty second, Earnhardt third, then Jeff Gordon in 4th, one of only 2 active drivers to be on this list.
Yep.
Do you think that's a little high for Jeff Gordon? Or you think that's about right?
I think it's about right, but I think it's a little surprising. I would have thought he would have fallen back a little and would have been closer to Jimmy. There's a couple of drivers in between him and Jimmy. I would have thought
like Cale and Darrell.
Cale and Darrell.
We're talking about.
Yeah, I would have thought it would have went, a combination of Petty, Earnhardt, and Pearson. That's the order I would have thought it would have been in. And then either Cale or Darrell, and then Jeff, and then Jimmy.
It's sort of like a football quarterback in the sense that you're so dependent on something else.
Yep.
You know, and in football, you're dependent on the receivers, you're dependent on the line, you're dependent on the running game, you're dependent on a lot of things to put up your numbers. A driver is obviously dependent on the car. So was that hard to sort of break that out and say this guy's driving skill sets him above?
It's a question that'll never be fully answered in NASCAR. It's always going to be, it's going to trail Jimmy Johnson for his whole life. You know, is it him? Is it the car? Is it Hendrick? Is it Chad Knaus? And Jeff Gordon went through the same thing,
and
too.
it's all of the above. I mean, that's the thing about it.
Yeah, and what people forget is, there are other people driving for Hendrick Motorsports who have not won 5 championships in a row, which is all of the drivers at Hendrick Motorsports. I think an interesting omission is Tony Stewart. That I think if you ask people in the motorsports world to give them the top 5 drivers all time, top 10 drivers all time, and it wasn't just NASCAR, Tony would be on it, and some of these other guys wouldn't. But when you're narrowing it just to NASCAR, it becomes a different question.
Well, it seems to me that wins have been emphasized. I don't know off the top of my head how many wins Tony Stewart has, but he certainly doesn't have as many as Bobby Allison or Darrell Waltrip or Cale Yarborough. Junior Johnson, if I remember correctly, has around 50.
That's right.
Tony's got 30-something.
Tony has 30-something. Yeah. So it seems like if people are emphasizing wins, maybe that's why Tony didn't quite make it, even though he's got 2 championships.
And not only that, the 2 championships, but I think raw ability, I bet he probably
the other
is better than some of those guys.
Thing that I think is interesting about NASCAR drivers over time is just the challenges are so different as the equipment has changed. The skills that drivers need to be successful are different. If you just look at the change in tires that we've seen over the years, from a bias ply tire to a radial and to some of the changes we've seen even this year, it really changes the kind of skill that a driver has to be successful. I mean, managing your tires used to be such a huge deal. With a bias ply tire, you could change the circumference of the tire by how you drove. With a radial tire, that's just non-existent now.
Yeah.
Right, and the other thing that's not being taken into account, or maybe it is influence. Obviously, Junior Johnson had a tremendous amount of influence. I mean, this is the guy who first discovered the draft on super speedways. Jeff Gordon has a tremendous amount of influence in terms of ushering in modern NASCAR. Do you think voters took that sort of thing into account, or were they really just focused on performance?
Well, we asked them to focus on performance, but I don't think you can separate the two. I think Jeff Gordon's stature in the sport certainly elevates him. If you had 2 drivers who accomplish the same thing and you have Jeff Gordon's personality and
the
Robbie
timing.
Gordon's personality, Jeff Gordon's going to be above him.
Lee Petty in 10th, 3 championships, but he's behind Bobby Allison, who had 1, and Junior Johnson, who had none, because we're talking about drivers.
And I think the same thing with Junior Johnson, that his impact on the sport was so massive that you can't, I mean, that's an important part about being a driver.
Absolutely right. It's certainly interesting, an interesting debate. You can read all about it in the, what's the date on this
October
issue?
10th issue of Sporting News, and obviously since you're watching this video on sportingnews.com, there's a version of this story there as well.
And we'll see you next time from right here in the Sporting News studios.